First video of the year. We making some progress. Horror is a really interesting genre when you look at films or TV shows. A lot of people who don't really pay attention to the genre tend to kind of judge it on whether or not they're scary. And while that's not inherently wrong, it's not really that accurate of a judgment to judge all horror movie media on. People seem to think that horror is more of a blanket genre with some differences here and there. Sometimes you'll have a thriller or a suspense film, maybe a slasher, comedy horror if we're getting the tiniest bit more niche, but horror is a lot more diverse than that. Using this as a blanketing idea for horror films actually misses out on a lot of really cool films that don't really fit into any of that. Horror is very diverse and has a lot of different little subgenres within it. These different genres create entirely unique films that vary in themes and cinematography, basically in anything. Some films don't really pull it off very well, but that basically happens with any other genre. Because people treat it like a blanket genre, they tend to judge each film whether they're scary enough, well-paced, if the jump scares are too much, which it's a whole other issue when it comes to some horror films. But sometimes what they view as a flaw in the movie is actually just a staple of its subgenre, and sometimes that can take someone out of it if that's just not their subgenre to watch. I feel like people put horror under a lot more scrutiny because if you mess up beyond the special effects, something that's just kind of bad can be a whole lot worse. This can be especially bad if a film relies on metaphors, analogies, or just really sensitive themes. Some horror films can mess up so badly that it's just really hard to watch for varying types of reasons. And unlike other films like action films or things like that, it can feel a lot worse with a horror film. But horror as a genre has such a wide variety of subgenres that each one achieves a different goal for the type of movie the person's going for. Think of the genre as being a community garden. Horror is the plot of land that you plant your seeds in. Each different fruit or vegetable is a different subgenre of horror. Sometimes you just take one of them and you make something really great out of it. Sometimes you take two or more and create something really great as well. Additionally, the quality of some movies do not always show the quality of the rest of the genre. If one of your crops becomes rotten, the movie is just genuinely bad or awful, then all you need to do is take it away from the rest of the crops. Basically, just don't watch it anymore and make sure other people are aware of how bad it is. But if a piece of the crop is just misshapen, a movie that's a bit weird and just not your style of movie, then it's okay to leave it for someone else to enjoy. The horror genre actually has a lot of small subgenres that you can mix and match to your heart's content. Each genre actually has a different goal within that type of genre that each film achieves differently than another one. One of the complicated things about these subgenres is because they mix and match a lot, some of them also do kind of go hand in hand or are a little bit similar to each other. Some have a lot of overlap, but some are still very distinct in the type that they are. Because of this, I made this video to talk about each subgenre, what makes them that subgenre, and give an example of a movie that uses that subgenre as its primary focus. These movie examples won't necessarily all be good or bad, they're just a movie that does show off that genre as its primary focus. These subgenres tend to be the primary base for most movies. They can work either in isolation as a genre or can have other films mixed in. Some of these movies probably won't have examples next to them because as examples, they're pretty self-explanatory. Sci-fi horror. Generally, sci-fi horror films are horror films where the majority elements are fueled by sci-fi related elements, with some horror details thrown in. The Invisible Man, 1933. Though it's always filed under Universal Monsters, he isn't a monster at all. He is actually just a byproduct of a science experiment gone wrong, then goes insane. Alien, which I saw many people file alien movies as their own genre, but I think that's just getting into semantics and getting a little too specific. An alien is just an aspect of sci-fi, whether it's a horror film or not, so specifying alien gets a little too specific. Cube 2, Hypercube. While the original was more of an isolation and survival film, this one they added a sci-fi element to it to probably make it more exciting as a sequel. It didn't work, but it is an example of a sci-fi horror film. And lastly, there's Splice. And while it is kind of a creature feature because of the character Dren, but she is also just a byproduct of science fiction means. Comedy. Comedy horror films will show traditionally scary, horrifying, or gory things, but make very prominent jokes in a not-so-serious tone. They will even use whatever is happening in the film that's scary to aid to the comedy. Army of Darkness, What We Do in the Shadows, Shaun of the Dead, Psycho Goreman, and Tucker and Dale vs. Evil are all very good examples of a horror comedy film. Body horror. Body horror films are where the human body is not only torn and ripped apart like in a torture film, but is completely mutilated beyond recognition. Things like bodies distorting, melding together, or stretching abnormally. Anytime you see something in a horror movie where a person's body looks absolutely unsettling beyond what you normally see, that's probably some sort of body horror. The Fly, 1986. While this is also a science fiction film, the focus of the film is more so on the physical transformation that Seth Brundle undergoes after using the science fiction means, so to me it's a little bit more of a body horror film than science fiction predominantly. Slither, Society 1989, and Tusk are also good examples of body horror films, but are a lot more harder to describe without just talking about the whole plot and spoiling it. Slasher. A slasher film is one of the biggest subgenres that most people tend to gravitate towards. The types of slasher films can also vary, which is the beauty of mixing and matching subgenres in the horror thing. Not in the horror thing. I know how to word. Anytime an ominous killer is mass killing people for whatever reason, then it's probably a slasher of some sort. The obvious examples being Friday the 13th and I Know What You Did Last Summer, as well as Slumber Party Massacre, American Psycho, and Orphan. Found footage. Found footage films are films that are portrayed as footage everyday people recorded that were later cobbled together after an event. The types of found footage can also vary, but still have the same basis of being a movie found after the fact. Apollo 18 being found footage from a space expedition, Creep being found footage of a man that hired another man to record him for mysterious reasons, Blair Witch Project, which is a found footage film making a documentary to find the Blair Witch, As Above, So Below, found footage of a woman making a documentary to justify her father's life's work, as well as The Taking of Deborah Logan, which is a found footage film framed as a documentary about a woman's descent into Alzheimer's. Cosmic. Cosmic horror is also frequently called Lovecraftian horror, but I feel like we've come so many decades away from just adapting a Lovecraft film that people are now doing something more inspired by the fear of something unknown from our space and time, which to me means that using cosmic horror as the name for the subgenre makes a little bit more sense because it's able to encompass a lot more. Color Out of Space, which is a Lovecraftian adaptation, The Void, which is more Lovecraft-inspired, Event Horizon, which is an in-space cosmic horror on a spaceship, The Mist, which has cosmic horror monsters scattered throughout, and Glorious, which is certainly a movie I saw last year. If you have a horror theme that is based around an otherworldly entity, then it's probably a cosmic horror of some kind. Tentacles are just an added bonus. Giallo. Giallo is inspired by a couple different subgenres to create its own unique one. They are usually Italian-made and are a mixture of a slasher and crime thriller films. They also tend to be filmed in a very unique way that frequently use vibrant colors in the cinematography, as well as using the editing, colors, and music to make parts feel nightmarish. Basically anything by Dario Argento fits. The Editor, which is an American version or homage of a giallo that was absolutely wild to watch, Stage Fright 1987, The Beyond, and Black Sunday 1960. All of these are a form of giallo. Normally when people talk about giallos, they are Italian, because that's where the genre usually came from. The Editor is an exception because they are made by American filmmakers, or either American or Canadian, I can't remember which one, but it was a non-Italian company that wanted to replicate the style of an Italian giallo, going as far as overdubbing the actors and making it seem tonally different, like they were speaking another language, even though the overdubbing was English and the lines were English. Cannibalism. Vorr, as my friend likes to call it apparently, is any sort of horror film that centers itself on one person eating other people. Raw, which is a French-Belgian, very interesting spin on a horror coming-of-age story. Ravenous, which I didn't want to put under folk horror because of the aspect of the Wendigo, because so many indigenous people have said that it is not an accurate representation of a Wendigo at all. But if you remove that aspect from this movie, which is just constant throwaway lines, it doesn't actually feel like it has much to do with the film, at least to me. Without that aspect, it is a really good example of a cannibal film still. Green Inferno and Hannibal. As long as you have people eating other people, it's gonna be a cannibal film of some sort. Also, it's so wild to me that there were two separate popular or popular-ish films last year that were cannibal films. What were we doing last year? Apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic. I bunched these two subgenres together because no matter what, they are still films revolving around an apocalyptic event, whether it's before or after. Apocalyptic films are set prior to, leading up to, and during the active apocalyptic event. Some good examples of this are The Happening, which shows the progression of some sort of plant causing people to commit suicide. War of the Worlds, which is an alien invasion happening in the moment. Hello, so editing Rav here. Looking this over actually does give me a good way to explain the difference between aliens being its own subgenre and them being just a part of the plot and what moves the plot. With a sci-fi movie, you can take away aliens and it can still be a sci-fi movie. War of the Worlds isn't inherently sci-fi, like it's set in modern day, but now that you have added aliens into it, it can add a flair for sci-fi, but they're only related to the aliens. It's basically one of those situations of all cacti are succulents, but not all succulents are cacti. So the same kind of applies here of not all sci-fi movies have aliens, but all movies with aliens have an aspect of sci-fi. And 28 Days Later, which is a virus movie showing the beginning stages of the virus affecting this man's world around him when he wakes up from a coma. Good examples of post-apocalyptic films are any apocalyptic event that you're seeing the aftermath of and people adjusting to their new way of life. 28 Weeks Later, which is after the apocalyptic event and now people are adjusting to keeping themselves safe from the virus-infected people. Bird Box, and I Am Legend. Folk horror. Folk horror can both be films based on real folklore from around the world, or something that just gives off the same feeling. They are often stories, usually in more rural settings, that deal with superstition, isolation, and will sometimes incorporate things like dark nature and give the vibes of stories told for generations. The Hollow, which focuses on Irish folklore of fairies and changelings. Lamb 2021, which gives the feelings of isolation on a sheep farm in Iceland and the type of story you feel like you would hear through a town like it was an urban legend. Wicker Man, which handles superstitions and a man's Christianity conflicting with the town he is investigating's paganism. Mermaid Lake of the Dead, which is based on Slavic folklore's Rusalka. Gothic. Gothic horror is one of the oldest genres of horror, whether you're looking in film or in books. It tends to show off stylized settings of Gothic architecture and just generally bleak settings with frequent hints of paranormal and supernatural. Most type of Dracula movies tend to fit this, whether it's old or new. Crimson Peak, Snow White, Tale of Terror, and Woman in Black. Techno Horror. When most people think of techno horror, I think they mostly think of the really big trend in the mid-2000s and early 2010s where there was a lot of films revolving around that type of theme. The genre is actually a lot more older than people think, though, because techno horror is just a horror film that focuses on a technological aspect. Really good examples of older ones would be The Stepford Wives from 1975. This is more tech and less sci-fi to me, because tech for me is more so technology within that time period, whether it is a movie from the 70s so they use what's available, or even the same for the 2000s movies, while sci-fi is more technology that we don't actually have yet, or at least didn't have when the movie came out. Videodrome, which is related to TV. The Ring 1998, I really hate putting 90s movies in old sections, but it's also related to TV. And newer examples of techno horror would be Shudder, which is related to cameras, Fear.com, which is related to the internet, Stay Alive, which is related to video games, and Countdown, which is related to phone apps. If the plot feels very heavily driven by some sort of technology aspect, then it's probably some sort of techno horror. Survival. More frequently than not, a lot of people seem to associate survival horror with zombies, which isn't wrong, but if you take away the zombie aspect, there's actually a lot of different other kinds of survival horror films. Survival horror has a little bit more of a variance from type to type, as long as it's a person or group of people surviving something in a very scary type of way, then it's a survival horror of some sort. Battle Royale is surviving being pit against each other to kill or be killed. Saw, which is surviving traps created to make you contemplate the things you have done wrong. The Green Room, which is trying to survive escaping a venue filled with Nazis. And Cube, surviving a giant puzzle that has traps you must avoid like you are a lab rat. I also didn't realize how many survival films there are that are just escape room films. I'm not surprised. Like, cash in on whatever you can that scares people, but there are so many more escape room films than I thought that there were. Any movie whose basis is watching a person or a group of people surviving something, then it is going to be a survival horror of some sort. The difference between survival films and slasher films are what you focus on. Are you focusing on the slasher and how they're affecting the people, or are you focusing on how the person is coping with the survival? Romance. Romance films are less so scary, but they can be scary depending on how you do it. Romance horror films are more so based in the romance, and can have varying levels of scary because of this. As long as the focal point of your horror film has something to do with romance, then it's going to be a romance horror of some sort. Warm Bodies, which is romance with a zombie, Only Lovers Left Alive, which is romance with vampires, The Shape of Water, which is romance with a fish guy, and Ghost, which is romance with a ghost. Queer horror. Queer horror films are horror films that are inherently rooted in themes of queerness. Whether they are centered on queer issues, predominantly focus on queer people, or just have a lot of queer themes, as long as it's a film that queer and trans people heavily identify with, or are made by queer people, it's gonna be a queer film of some sort. Demons of Dorothy, which is a short film about a woman and how her being a lesbian has affected her as a filmmaker. They/Them, which revolves around a gay conversion camp, which I actually don't think the movie is as bad as a lot of the reception it was getting. It's definitely a hard watch and one of those issues of depictions versus endorsement, and it is more so depiction than endorsement. The Perfection, which is centered on two sapphic women, Jennifer's Body, which is just queer-coded, and Interview with a Vampire, which is also very queer-coded, but tried to go as much as they could with confirming gay themes. Thriller and suspense. Thriller and suspense films are more so focused on the edge of your seat feeling that they give you, rather than scary. They more so hinge on the twists and turns that they can provide in your film. They rely on the aspect of the ominous feeling of someone watching you behind any corner, or just the feeling of dread you get if you feel like you're being followed. Get Out, Misery, Pitch Black, Hush, which is more so in the home invasion realm of this subgenre, and Summer of '84, which is less so a slasher because it's a group of teens investigating the serial killer and you don't see most of the horrifying stuff till the end. Thriller and suspense films I actually frequently see get the reception of, if you call your horror film thriller or suspense, you're just trying to be highbrow and you don't want to call yourself horror, which I understand the thoughts behind that, and I definitely think it's fueled by some of the rare handful of filmmakers that do speak that way, but that's not what it is. Thriller and suspense are actually just another subgenre of horror movies. They just do things differently than what you usually anticipate, and they are a valid version of horror, whether certain filmmakers or other people like it or not. To go back to the garden analogy, these subgenres, while they are the fruits and vegetables in the garden, they are one type of produce, but have several different versions of them. Real examples would be things like how there are so many different kinds of apples, so many kinds of potatoes, at least 3 different kinds of strawberries. Things like that, where they have a base kind, but then kind of splinter off a lot. Because of this, I tried to organize these subgenres into umbrella genres that make the most sense to bunch up so that I'm not going on for a million years. Psychological. Psychological films have 2 different kinds. There are madness and paranoia films, and phobia and isolation. In some ways, both of these can be very similar to each other, but each have their own specific ways of portraying themselves that help you know which kind they are. Madness and paranoia. These films are centered on the feeling of going mad. They make you watch or feel like you're going insane with the character, feeling like anything can be around any corner. Good examples of these would be Jacob's Ladder, which centers on madness induced by PTSD, the 2020 Invisible Man remake. While the original was more so a science fiction film, this one frames itself to watch the paranoia that this woman is going through, feeling like there's someone watching her but she can't prove it. Shutter Island, which is a man unable to come to grips with something he has done and is constantly driving himself insane, along with others aiding in his delusion. As well as Delirium 2018. This 2018 Delirium, not this one, because for some maddening reason they made 2 different horror films in the same year with the same name. I actually frequently don't like horror films that incorporate mental health into them, but that's more so because usually when people do it, they demonize the person whose mental health they're highlighting. But Delirium, at least this one, is really good at incorporating the main character's mental illness and using it to his disadvantage, but in the end showing that he wasn't wrong and not actually demonizing him at all. Phobia Isolation. Phobia and isolation films are more so honing in on making the main character physically feel isolated from another person or just the outside world in general. they will also highlight whatever fears that these characters might have. Gerald's game, because she is very literally isolated on a bed, dealing with all of the trauma she had gone through up to this point. The Lighthouse, which is two men isolated on a rock with a lighthouse they have to take care of. And Goodnight Mommy, which deals with the paranoia of their mother not being their mother, on top of them being stuck at the house with her. Creature features, or monster films. Creature features have a really wide range of films because of the different kinds of monsters they are, so they're both self-explanatory, but to also make it a little bit more brief, I'm going to limit it to one example per monster kind, just to make it go quicker. Vampire, pick anything out of a hat, let's say Jacob's Wife works. Werewolf, Ginger Snaps is a really good coming-of-age type of werewolf film. Zombie, once again, pick any movie. Zombies is a good one, I guess. Virus films, which are similar to zombie films, but the difference being that a virus film, the people infected have a lot more cognitive ability and a lot more strength, I guess, and affect the infected a bit different. A good example of this would be It Comes at Night, which focuses on the impact a specific family deals with due to a virus outbreak. Neo-monster. Neo-monsters are basically monsters that are created for a specific film. They usually aren't rooted in anything pre-existing, so either the lore or the design will be rooted purely in that movie. The best examples of these that I could find were things like Pumpkinhead and The Descent, and the last creature feature being Big and Small Creatures. Big and Small Creatures have an insane varying type because it's literally just down to size. So good examples of this would be a big creature film being something like Godzilla, and a small creature film being something like Gremlins. Paranormal. Paranormal films feel a lot more complicated, especially in the things that they incorporate, and very frequently they will go hand in hand with supernatural films. Frequently, a paranormal film will incorporate aspects of the supernatural, like the occult and exorcisms and things like that, into a paranormal film, so they intermingle a lot. To me, supernatural is more so just zeroed in on the concept of occults and possession and things like that, so I figured paranormal is a better umbrella term for the rest of it. Ghosts and spirits, which a good example would be Insidious and Ghostbusters. Haunted house, good examples would be Amityville Horror, pick one, there's over 40 of them for some reason. A Tale of Two Sisters, which actually had an American remake called The Uninvited, but I felt like this one might be a slightly better example of the two. And if you want a stupid option, The Ghost and Mr. Chicken. Possessions, demons, and occult. Good examples of this would be The Rite, The Craft, and Evil Dead. Supernatural, good examples would be Carrie due to supernatural powers, Constantine considering all this, and 1408 since supernatural forces seem to be changing everything around him and making the night repeat. Gore. There's actually a surprising range of the type of gore films that there are. Each one is mostly hinging on the specific style of it or the severity of the gore. Torture, generally movies that are really gory due to one or more people dealing with the physical torture at the hands of someone else, things like Hostel, Hard Candy, which is a person torturing a man that she wants to admit to being an abuser, and Funny Games, which is two men torturing a family in their home. Splatter. Splatter films are usually defined by their camera work and stylization. It's the way that the effects are done, the way that the camera focuses on the gore effects. If it feels like the camera person is just reveling in the unsettling things happening on screen that are gory, it's most likely a splatter film of some sort. Things like Terrifier, House of a Thousand Corpses, and High Tension. And the last of the gore subgenres being extreme. Extreme films also tend to have a varying range from just kind of gross to being absolutely disgusting and hard to watch. There are a lot of videos that people have made to show the downward spiral these movies can get into. Because of this, I would prefer to not talk too much in detail about some of these films or the more severe examples of them, so I'll give the mildly tamer examples that I either can stomach or I have stomached at least once before. Human Centipede is one of the more obvious examples of this that people go to when they want to shock their friends. You know, when you just are up at 2 a.m. in the morning, you can't think of anything to watch, and the infamous Human Centipede pops up in your Netflix recommendations, so you fuck around and find out. I Spit on Your Grave, which is one of those titular good for her films, because it's a woman going and murdering the men who raped her. Also, I have a side tangent. Why is Walmart recommending the remake of this to their customers? Even if it's the remake, it's still a really hard film to watch, and it's in a from sweet to scary section for Valentine's Day, apparently. And that is beyond scary. You are like thrusting some people unknowingly into some trauma they might get. Holy shit. Art house. Art house horror films have roughly two different types. Depending on the type you watch, it could very well give you epileptic seizures because of the editing, or it can make you very uncomfortable with the way things are filmed. So I would be careful with these films if you have some photosensitive triggers or just triggers in general mental health wise. Erotic horror, which is usually horror films that are rooted in sexual themes or driven by sexual themes. These sexual themes have a varying range from consensual to not as well. This is one of those other subgenres within these that I would be careful with them if you are more sensitive to non-consensual things, because this is one of those genres that are going to be a lot more rooted in that topic and theme, I guess. Blue Velvet, which is a lot of a movie to unpack. Possession, which I have noticed is getting a lot more popular recently, apparently, especially since it got put onto Shudder. I don't know if it's still on there, though. Suspiria 2018, which the remake is also just a good example of taking the base concept for a film and expanding on it. Avantgarde Experiment. Avant-garde or experimental films are rooted in going against what contemporary film, or in this case, contemporary horror films usually are doing. Whether it's the filming techniques or the narrative techniques, they're usually very stylized and also depend from director to director. Though this section of art house films does tend to lean more into the possible epileptic seizures or just really disturbing imagery, so be careful for that one in this part. Beyond the Black Rainbow, which is very stylized visually and directed by Panos Cosmatos before he directed Mandy. Eraserhead, a very classic example most people go to when they think of this subgenre, or just David Lynch in general. House 1977, which is a very popular Japanese film that people go to in this subgenre a lot too, or Skinamarink, which frames itself in a way to purposely cause unease, disorientation, and anxiety. Nothing is framed for you to fully understand what's happening, and you never get answers by the end of the film anyway. The editing makes you feel constantly like something is going to happen with the static shots, whether they actually do happen or not. All of the films in this avant-garde experimental section tend to be very visually stylized a lot, and will have a varying range depending on what filmmaker you're watching. Nature horror films are pretty self-explanatory. They're just horror films that take place in or around nature predominantly. The two different kinds of nature films, however, the first one being backwoods. Backwoods horror films are generally horror movies where humans are usually the villains in a very rural setting. The type of rural setting can also change from film to film. The Hills Have Eyes, which is a desert hill country type of rural, Eden Lake, which is based by a lake in a wooded English countryside, and Tourist Trap, which is based in a secluded roadside attraction. Usually, if it's set in an isolated setting near or around nature, then it's probably going to be a backwoods horror film of some sort. The other nature type would be animals. Basically just any horror movie where the animal was the main antagonist. Any of the millions of shark films, Cujo, which is a dog attack, Black Sheep, which is killer sheep, Willard, which is killer rats, and Crawl, which is an alligator attack. You got an animal killing people? Well, then it's an animal horror film. And that's basically it when you come down to base horror subgenre types. If you start finding more, they're probably just more niche or getting into semantics. But as is, these are a pretty good basis of the types of horror genres that there can be. Figuring out what horror subgenre works best for you is sadly going to be one of those situations of just trial and error. It takes a lot of research and sometimes just trying it out and hoping for the best. When looking into horror films for yourself, it's always good to research the film you're wanting to possibly watch, because sadly, horror films are just ingrained with some topics and themes that are really hard to watch for a lot of people, which is valid. Sometimes some horror subgenres just aren't gonna be your thing, and that's valid, and no one should make fun of you for not liking a certain kind of horror subgenre. Not all horror subgenres are for everyone. Some are a lot harder to watch or stomach, some has imagery that can be really triggering for some people, and sometimes some films aren't extreme enough. It's all a matter of preference and the types of things that you personally can handle. Not everyone can handle the same levels of horror as everyone else, but still want to be able to indulge in the horror genre so that they can either get more used to it or find what they could like. Like with a community garden, sometimes the things that are grown are going to be delicious and your favorite things, and sometimes some of them are going to have taste and texture issues for you. And some you just won't be able to stomach at all. And like with food, you need to respect what some people can and cannot handle. What is your favorite horror movie subgenre?
So, I think like my top two are probably sci-fi and body horror.
That's fair. Do you have any like movie specifics you really like from those two?
From sci-fi, I really like the Alien franchise. I'm like a slut for the fucking Alien franchise. Like I love it so much. Like it's so creepy, and like I just watched the first one today. Like I forced my roommate to watch it with me because I haven't seen it since I was like 5, and it traumatized me. I'm gonna be real. I'm probably gonna have nightmares tonight. Like as far as like body horror, like I'm really into like Hellraiser. The whole like Cenobites being like blah 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 blah, come to hell and experience like ultimate pleasure and pain, blah, blah, and I'm like, oh cool, and like the scene where they like go in and you can see like the flesh pillar and shit. Like I was like, oh, like this is what like straight like normal vanilla people must think like BDSM clubs are like.
Oh no, you're not wrong. Probably we matching. So, my friend Rocco, my producer, what is your favorite horror movie genre? As the man who has looked over my script.
Well, just off of the list, because there's so many, I'm really into psychological horror and just like the greater genre of like gothic horror, so like a lot of like crossover between like psychological and supernatural, like
Yeah.
I love a classic ghost story.
So Guillermo del Toro.
Yeah.
Do you have any specific favorites of that realm?
I really love The Innocents. You know, like a truly classic classic ghost stories are classic for a reason, you know? And like I love supernatural stories, and the way so many of them invoke fears through metaphor.
Yeah.
And like these fears, which are like, you know, metaphysical fears, take on a real form, whether it's like a ghost or like some kind of horrible creature. Like specifically, like a lot of gothic stuff appeals to me because, you know, you get like the psychological gothic horror, and supernatural gothic horror is a lot of the way it invokes fears about the past coming back to haunt you.
Yeah.
And I find that very engaging.
Do you like a lot of the, like, old Vincent Price movies?
Yes, no, like, I watch so many black and white horror movies, like, I mean, one of the things I love about those old movies is that part of it is because, you know, the set options were limited. It was hard to make realistic movies the way we can now, but, like, they really took on, like, the horror at a metaphorical level. And because of that, I feel like a lot of them leaned into like surrealism,
Yeah.
their costuming and sets, and it's impressive when something larger than life can still be scary. Because
Mm-hmm.
it's easier when it's real and you walk around and you think like, I just watched a scary monster movie in a neighborhood that looked like my neighborhood. What's the scary monsters in my neighborhood? where something that looks totally unbelievable. Like you look at the world that they walk in, you're like, these sets don't look real, these costumes don't look real, they're not believable, these monsters don't look believable, but it's still scary because the horror, it lives in your brain.
It
Psychological. It's all psychological.
Yeah. My friend Zinnia, what's your favorite horror subgenre?
Okay, list some off of me, cause bimbo, no thought, only look pretty.
The different subgenres that I can think of just off the top of my head, there's anything paranormal or supernatural, the more experimental end, there's gore, nature, creature features, techno horror, thriller, suspense, comedy, sci-fi, gothic, romance.
So I have 3, depending on my hyperfixation at the time.
That's fair.
Creature feature,
Mhm.
cause monster fucker, obviously. Science fiction and gothic.
Yeah, that makes sense for you. The horror genre is so wide and vast and has so many different types within it that as long as you like horror even a little bit, there's going to be something for you to enjoy. Some films are absolutely amazing, some are not so amazing, and some are just absolutely terrible, whether you can watch them terrible or you have to pretend they never existed terrible. So with this roadmap of the horror types laid out for you, I hope you can take this and find something that you may have not had a definition for and couldn't find before, and are able to find it now. If you end up using any of the movies that I did actually list as an example, let me know if you ended up loving or hating any of the specific ones, or if there is a specific subgenre you like the most, and what examples of those you might like the most. Just have fun and be safe when looking for horror movies. Be kind and enjoy all things spooky. And don't disrespect people's horror movie preferences, please.